Hi, welcome back. It's Neil here, and we're looking at the second part, the mechanics of the interview. And as you can see from this mind map, I actually took this mechanics of the interview section from the textbook and put it into my AI machine, and this is what I created. As you can see, there's too much here to cover in 10 minutes of a video, let alone a whole week or even a semester. We could spend a whole year studying all of these areas. So I'm going to try and simplify it for you in 4 parts, and I might take this video to go through part 1 and part 2. Let's see how long it takes, and then we'll follow up with another video for part 3 and part 4. But in a sense now, those 4 parts are going to be like, part 1 is going to be looking at the introduction questions, informative type questions to ask. Part 2 is more about the non-verbal space, how to go from non-sensitive to sensitive questioning, dealing with difficult people. Part 3 of the mechanics of interviews looks at admissions type questions, and part 4 of the mechanics of interview are looking at confession type questions, because at the end of the day, you start a fraud investigation to get to the end. And ideally, you'd like to get an interviewee across the confession line if they are the ultimate perpetrator. All right. So let's get into the part 1 of the mechanics of the interview. And it may be that we start off with, I work here at the company. Have we met before? I'm working on an assignment and I need your help. Do you have a few minutes I can spend with you now? And you're trying to be friendly to get someone into the interview without making an appointment. Well, of course, you may need to get their boss's approval. You may need to get different approval inside the organization, but having done that, it's a way of approaching someone to just begin more of a casual, informal stage of the interviewing. Wow. All right. So the mechanics of the interview part 1 is where we're really trying to start off that interview. So let's begin with the methodology of the interview. And that's where you probably need to think about the personal space. You need to think about the physical contact. You need to think about getting agreement, not just with the interviewee, but also with senior management or different people in the organization that have control over the interviewee. You need to think about the private setting and a commitment for assistance that has been provided by senior management or something like that. You need to have a clear statement on the purpose of the interview. So that's a sort of a minimal starting point that you need to have. Then you can start with some introductory questions where you establish rapport. Oh, I work here in so-and-so. Have we met before? Okay, all right. And provide an introduction. What are you doing? I'm here to understand more about how the weaknesses in the internal control system came about, rather than I'm here to discover who caused the weaknesses in the internal control system. All right. So introductory questions, it's a warming up. All right. And then before we go into informational questions you need to think about having open questions. Be careful to know and be aware of asking leading questions and closed questions. And you think about different types of informational questions that are provided in the textbook. And finally, we have informational question techniques. And what do we mean by that? Well, try to understand the theme of several questions that you might ask in a row, rather than one question at a time and they're not even related. All right. It may be a timeline. During the month of May, there were certain events that happened. Can you tell me a little bit about where were you and what was your role in the organization? And so before you talk about what happened in June and before you talk about what happened in July. So that's one way of sequencing and themerizing the different questions you're asking by time. Be careful to ask single questions, all right? And make sure your questions are in a systematic order and have a narrative follow-up, all right? A thematic follow-up, so several questions on the weaknesses of internal controls that were discovered in May. All right. So this is great. To start off the mechanics of the interview, we're talking about getting the right space, the right setting set up, introductory questions, and then we can start on more informational questions, which are more tied to the strategy of the interview, tying back to the first video about what is the purpose of your interview. So 2 more examples we have is, I understand that you were present when the internal controls were developed. Because you were not directly involved in this matter, I'm sure you won't mind discussing it with me. And so that's a way of putting the interviewee at ease. And it comes across as non-accusatory. And that's very important when you're trying to just gather information. And that's very important when you don't have that stack of evidence to accuse the interviewee, your information gathering. All right. And so here are some of the different types of questions I mentioned earlier. So let's just have a look at some of the other techniques you need to be aware of at this introductory stage. As I said, begin by asking questions that are unlikely to cause respondents to become defensive or hostile. Give respondents ample time to answer. Do not rush them. Get all the facts. Almost every respondent can give you information beyond what is initially provided. And one other part, upon concluding the direct questioning, summarize the facts and have the respondents verify that your summary is correct. So you might repeat what you interpret to be the meaning of what the respondent is saying to you. And you ask the respondent, is this correct? In your view, I just want to make sure that I've got the information correct. Okay. So this is an early stage in thinking about how to get into that interview. Now, if we go to mechanics of the interview part 2, this is where we have more advanced strategies, because we may need to deal with denial. We may need to deal with the resistance, difficult people, or volatile people. So there are common objections given by difficult people and those that are resisting giving information. They might say they are too busy. They might want to clarify your requests. They may have lack of knowledge, or they may fail to remember, or deliberately fail to remember, right? So there are strategies in dealing with them. So you need to empathize. I understand that you may not fully remember what is going on, but we're just trying to piece together the different parts, and we really appreciate the assistance that you can give in this respect. And we're trying to facilitate agreement. We're trying to be non-reactionary, and we just need to just be aware of where the interviewee is at. Okay. And maybe you might need to have 2 interviewers, especially when you're likely to believe that the interviewee is going to be volatile or violent in the interview. Again, theme development is important. Again, observing the respondent reactions will help you to get a sense of where the respondent is at. And so I'll just go over these shortly. Then we had theme development, where we need to maintain open communication, question formulation, information elucidation. That is, you need to be confident in the questions you're asking and not dibble-dally around the questions that you're asking. And ask questions that are non-accusatory. Avoid strong emotions. Again, along the theme of being empathetic, but being professional and more direct towards the information goals that you have set for the interview. Finally, when we are observing respondent reactions, we just need to be aware of proxemics, and that is the distance between you and the interviewee. We need to be aware of chronomics, and that is the time sense that your interviewee has. Is the interviewee on time? Is the interviewee, based on observations of their boss or colleagues, sensitive to being on time in the organization. So what is their demeanor towards time? Kinetics. Be aware of the body language of the interviewee, because 70, 80% of their body language makes up their communication, and less than 30 or 20% of what they say is what is being communicated. Finally, paralinguistics, a full range of verbal cues via oral communication. Again, this is more advanced strategy of your awareness of the interviewee and the interviewer setting, where it is held, the body language. How close are you to the interviewee? In some countries, you can be closer than in other countries. Paralinguistics, just be aware of the body language. Okay, continuing on the theme development, and especially as you want to get from introductory to more informative, extracting interview type questions. Nothing closes the lines of communication in interviews like accusatory questions. Move from non-sensitive to sensitive. Always start with non-sensitive. And as you're working through that theme, maybe you're in that month of May and you're talking about internal controls. So you stay non-sensitive. So you just ask them, what do you know about challenges that the firm had with the weaknesses in internal control system during May? Before you get on to questions about where were you in these particular weeks in May? Were you working in the warehouse in May? Okay, so that's very direct and sensitive, whereas the first one is much more non-sensitive and non-direct. And following, do not be reluctant to ask sensitive questions after you have established proper basis. If you know that the interviewee has worked in that warehouse and was there during May, then you can ask that sensitive question about what were you doing in the warehouse? What were your specific duties in the warehouse during May? If you pose the question with confidence and show that you expect an answer, respondents are much more likely to furnish the requested information. If you are apologetic or lack confidence in the question, respondents are much less likely to answer. That's the difference that you need to think about. So always, you may need to rehearse your questioning. You need to think thematically. You need to think about how questions need to go together. And if they are to go together, the non-sensitive questions need to come first and come before the sensitive questions. And finally, in this part 2 of the mechanics of the interview, dealing with resistance and difficult people, I just want to repeat again, all right? Just be aware that they may come back at you in terms of, I'm too busy. I don't know anything. I don't remember. What do you mean by that? You need to think of how you can keep your demeanor and don't react, right? Disarm the person, all right? Go back, change tactics. Maybe you need to go from a sensitive question back to a non-sensitive question. Make it easy for them to say yes, all right? But really, at the beginning, if you know they're going to be difficult, you may need to use surprise. What do we mean? You may need to schedule an interview without them knowing, with the boss's consent, with manager's consent. And so you say, look, I have consent from your boss. We need to interview you now. And so it catches them off guard. It doesn't give them a chance to call their lawyer, to call their friend in, to call other colleagues in. And if it's likely to be volatile, need to use 2 interviewers. And think about hypothetical questions. And that is a way of desensitizing a sensitive question. So you might say, is there any reason why she would have done it? Rather than, did she do it? All right. Just like Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men saying, did you order a code red? Okay. All right. You've obviously, that was a very sensitive question for him to ask. But remember, that came after a dozen or more questioning and backwards and forward in the courtroom drama. You know that. And he knew that if he followed that theme, how the interviewee, that is Colonel Jessup in A Few Good Men will react if he can build him up in that movie. So that's an example of how you go from non-sensitive to sensitive. So if you ask that sensitive question right off the bat, they'll just say, nope, next question. And then you're done and dusted. And your goal of your interview as an information extracting procedure fails. So again, the big thing to take away from this part 1 and part 2, yes, think about the space, think about the interviewee's demeanor, whether they're going to be volatile or not, but also you need to think about the thematic grouping of your questions, and always go from non-sensitive to sensitive type questions. This finishes the end of part 1 and part 2 of the mechanics of the interview. I'll see you in part 3 and part 4. Bye for now.